The piercing wail of sirens jolted Ethan Walker awake. He shot upright on his couch, his heart pounding, the distant sound cutting through the quiet of the early morning. Beside him, Rocky, his brindle mutt, was already alert, ears perked and body tense. The storm from earlier had faded, leaving behind a damp stillness that now seemed unnaturally fragile. Ethan didn't need to think twice. He pulled on his boots and grabbed his coat, already heading for the door. Rocky followed without hesitation, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as they moved. The smell of smoke hit Ethan before he saw it, a thick, acrid warning carried on the damp morning air. Around the corner, flames devoured the small house at the end of the street. Neighbors stood in clusters, their faces pale in the flickering orange light. The fire roared, sending embers spiraling into the sky. For a moment, Ethan froze, his mind flashing back to a fire from years ago, one he hadn't been able to outrun. A sharp bark from Rocky pulled him back. The dog's gaze was locked on the blaze, his body trembling with barely restrained energy. Ethan crouched beside him, gripping his collar. "Not this time, buddy," he muttered, trying to steady his own nerves. "We're staying out of this one." Ethan cursed, his boots skidding on wet grass as he sprinted after him. "Rocky!" he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the crackling inferno. Panic clawed at him as the dog disappeared into the thick smoke, his brindle coat blending into the chaos. Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps as he reached the edge of the burning yard, the heat from the fire scorching his face. "Rocky!" he called again, desperation creeping into his voice. He couldn't lose him, not now, not like this. For agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then, out of the haze, Rocky emerged, coughing and covered in soot. In his mouth, he carried something small, a crumpled envelope, its edges singed. Ethan's relief was short-lived, as Rocky barked again, his body tense and pointed toward the house. "No!" Ethan said firmly, grabbing his collar. "You're not going back in!" Ethan's chest tightened as he watched the dog vanish once more. This wasn't bravery, it was madness, and yet a part of him understood. He had been like that once, running headfirst into danger without thinking about the cost. The seconds stretched into eternity before Rocky reappeared, this time with something far more precious. Clutched carefully in his jaws was a kitten, its tiny body limp but alive. Ethan didn't think. He rushed forward, scooping both Rocky and the kitten into his arms as he stumbled away from the heat. By the time they reached safety, the crowd had erupted into murmurs. Someone handed Ethan a blanket, while others stared at Rocky in awe. The dog didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on the kitten, nudging it gently with his nose, as if to reassure himself it was still breathing. Ethan sank onto the curb, his body shaking as adrenaline coursed through him. Rocky sat beside him, his tail thumping weakly against the ground. For a moment, neither of them moved, the chaos of the scene fading into the background. "You're a damn fool," Ethan said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Rocky looked up at him, his dark eyes steady and unflinching. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet resolve of a creature who had faced death and won. The kitten let out a faint meow, breaking the spell. Ethan glanced down, his fingers brushing against its damp fur. The fire had been contained, the flames no longer threatening to spread, but the damage had been done. As the firefighters worked to douse the remaining embers, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this night had set something in motion, something he wasn't ready to face. He looked back at Rocky, who was now lying beside him, his breathing slowing to a steady rhythm. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, buddy," Ethan muttered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't Rocky who needed to explain anything. It was himself. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Ethan stood, cradling the kitten in one arm and gripping Rocky's leash with the other. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of how close they had come. But there was something else too, a spark of something Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Come on," he said softly, leading Rocky back toward their house. "We've got work to do." The faint scent of smoke clung to his jacket, and Rocky padded in behind him, his fur damp from the rain and streaked with soot. The kitten in Ethan's arms stirred, letting out a feeble mew. Ethan set it down gently on the table, grabbing a towel to dry it off. Rocky sat beside the table, his eyes fixed on the tiny creature. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand along the dog's back. "You're unbelievable, you know that," he muttered. Rocky let out a soft huff, as if he understood. The adrenaline that had fueled Ethan during the fire was fading now, replaced by exhaustion and something deeper, a gnawing unease. Fires like the one tonight weren't common in their quiet neighborhood. It wasn't just the flames or the chaos that unsettled him. It was how quickly it had all come back. The heat, the sirens, the helplessness. Ethan glanced at the kitten, which was now curled into a tight ball, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily. He turned to Rocky. "Looks like you saved 2 lives tonight, huh?" A figure stood on the lawn, talking animatedly with a firefighter. It was the homeowner, a woman Ethan recognized but didn't know well. Her face was pale, and her hands moved frantically as she gestured toward the house. "Stay here," Ethan said to Rocky, who gave him a skeptical look. Ethan grabbed his coat again and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, carrying the distinct smell of ash and wet grass. As he approached the house, Ethan overheard snippets of the conversation. "It doesn't make sense," the woman was saying, her voice cracking. "We weren't home. There was nothing left on. How could this happen?" The idea of arson unsettled him. Fires didn't just start randomly, especially in a house where no one was home. And Rocky's reaction, his determination to enter that house, felt too purposeful, too instinctive. When he returned home, Rocky was waiting by the door, his tail wagging. Ethan sighed, scratching the dog's head as he walked in. "You've got a nose for trouble, don't you?" Tonight wasn't just a coincidence. There was something about the way Rocky had reacted, like he knew someone or something was in danger. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Ethan said aloud. The words felt strange, but the more he thought about it, the more they made sense. Rocky's past was mostly a mystery. The shelter had told him the dog had been found wandering near a construction site, badly injured. They didn't know where he'd come from or what he'd been through. Ethan leaned back in his chair, memories of his own past creeping in unbidden. Fires were unpredictable, unforgiving. He'd seen more than his share during his years as a firefighter, but no matter how many he faced, there were always some that stayed with him. The ones where he hadn't been fast enough, brave enough, the ones he hadn't been able to save. He glanced at Rocky, who was now lying beside the table, his head resting on his paws. The dog looked content, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that hinted at a life lived on the edge of danger. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. He stood, his body tense, and opened it to find a firefighter standing on his porch. "Mr. Walker," the man said, his expression serious, "we need to talk." Rocky, ever vigilant, was at his side, ears perked and tail stiff. The man on the porch shifted, glancing past Ethan toward the inside of the house. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Ethan hesitated but stepped aside, motioning him in. "Sure. What's this about?" "I wanted to ask you about your dog. Dogs don't just charge into burning buildings unless they know what they're doing." "Look," the captain said, leaning back in his chair, "I'm not here to interrogate you. But I'll be honest, this fire doesn't sit right with me. We're investigating it as a possible arson. If there's something about your dog's background that could help, it might be worth looking into." He glanced down at Rocky, who met his gaze with steady, unflinching eyes. "I'll think about it," Ethan said finally. Foster seemed to take that as enough and stood. "Appreciate your time. And keep an eye on your dog. He might know more than we do." The dog tilted his head, his ears twitching as if he understood. Ethan shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You really are full of surprises." He was malnourished and injured, but they managed to get him out. No tags or microchip. If Rocky had been near a disaster site, and if his behavior during the fire was any indication, it was possible he'd been trained for search and rescue. But by who and why had he been abandoned? That evening, Ethan sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. Rocky lay at his feet, his eyes half closed but alert. The kitten, now more energetic, explored the porch steps under Rocky's watchful gaze. "You've got a story, don't you?" Ethan said softly. Rocky's ears perked, but he didn't move. "I don't know where you came from, but it's clear you were meant for something bigger." And as much as he wanted to leave the past buried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Rocky's story was now his own. The quiet was broken by a sudden, sharp bark from Rocky. The dog stood, his body tense, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Ethan followed his line of sight and saw a figure standing at the edge of the street, barely visible in the fading light. "Stay here," Ethan murmured, rising to his feet. But when he looked back, the figure was gone. Ethan paced the living room, his mind racing as he replayed the shelter worker's words. A collapsed building, Louisville, barking under the rubble. The pieces were there, but they didn't fit together yet. Rocky lay nearby, his eyes tracking Ethan's every movement. The kitten had claimed the back of the couch, oblivious to the growing tension. "You're not just any dog," Ethan muttered, stopping to kneel beside Rocky. He rubbed the dog's ears, staring into his dark, unblinking eyes. "Someone trained you. Someone taught you to run into danger. The question is, who?" "There's a program that trains rescue dogs out in Louisville. Private group, works with law enforcement and disaster teams. It's not common knowledge, but when I mentioned the details about your dog, someone there said it sounded familiar. I'll look into it." Rocky sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, enjoying the breeze. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. For all the mystery surrounding Rocky, moments like this reminded Ethan of the dog's simple joy in being alive. When they arrived at the Summit Canine Rescue Facility, Ethan was struck by its scale. A sprawling property surrounded by high fences, it looked more like a military base than a training center. A woman in her 40s, dressed in practical outdoor gear, greeted them at the gate. "You must be Ethan Walker," she said, her sharp eyes studying him and Rocky. "I'm Lauren Hale, director here." Captain Foster called ahead. "That sounds like him, but how did he end up in a shelter?" "If he is, he's been through hell. Dogs like Rocky bond deeply with their handlers. Losing one is like losing a limb." The landslide hit faster than anyone expected. Inside was a photo of a younger Rocky, standing beside a man in uniform, a man who had trusted him with his life. "Take care of him," Lauren said. "He's one of the best we ever trained." The sun was setting as Ethan pulled into his driveway, the truck's headlights illuminating the front porch. Rocky jumped out as soon as the door opened, his tail wagging as he stretched his legs. Ethan followed, clutching the file Lauren had given him. Inside were not just the details of Rocky's training, but the photo of the man who had trained him, a handler who had trusted Rocky with his life. Ethan set the file on the kitchen table, staring at the picture. The man's face was kind, his smile genuine. Rocky stood beside him, his posture proud and attentive. It was a stark reminder of the life Rocky had lost, and the weight of the responsibility Ethan now felt to honor that. "Come here, buddy," Ethan said softly, motioning to Rocky. The dog trotted over, his ears perked. Ethan held the photo up. "Do you remember him?" Whatever bond Rocky had with his handler was still etched in his memory, even after all this time. Ethan sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "You've been through a lot, haven't you? But you kept going, even when everything fell apart." The dog's story had given Ethan a renewed sense of purpose, and he found himself drawn to the idea of channeling Rocky's talents. Ethan hadn't stepped into a fire station in years, but the thought of using Rocky's skills to help others sparked something in him he hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan began researching local search and rescue groups, but he hesitated to make any commitments. A part of him was still haunted by the past, the lives he couldn't save, the guilt he carried. Could he really go back to that world? One evening, as Ethan and Rocky walked through the neighborhood, they passed the charred remains of the house that had burned down. It was fenced off now, the smell of smoke long gone, but the sight still sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Funny, isn't it?" Ethan said aloud, glancing at Rocky. "This whole thing started with you running into that house. You couldn't help yourself. You had to save someone." He let out a low bark, his gaze fixed on the house. Ethan followed his line of sight and spotted a firefighter standing by the fence, Captain Foster. "Ethan!" Foster called, waving him over. Ethan approached, Rocky trotting at his side. "What are you doing here?" A neighbor's security camera caught someone leaving the scene just before the fire started. "We're following up." That night, Ethan sat on the porch, the file from Summit K9 Rescue in his lap. He flipped through the pages, reading about Rocky's training and the missions he had been part of. Each word felt like a challenge, a reminder that Rocky wasn't the only one who had been tested by fire. The kitten, now fully recovered, scampered across the porch steps, pouncing on a stray leaf. Rocky watched it with a mix of patience and amusement, his body relaxed but alert. Ethan couldn't help but smile. "You know," he said, glancing at Rocky, "you've got a knack for saving lives. Maybe it's time we put that to use." But their bond made the process smoother, their trust in each other unshakable. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling training session, the team leader approached Ethan. "You and Rocky make a hell of a pair," she said. "You ever think about getting back into this full time? And dogs like Rocky?" It wasn't fear, it was focus, the kind that came from knowing someone's life depended on them. Rocky moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, his body language sharp and alert. Suddenly, Rocky stopped, his ears perking. He barked once, then twice, before bolting forward. Ethan followed, his heart racing. Moments later, they found the hiker, a young woman, collapsed but alive. Ethan radioed the team as Rocky lay beside her, his presence calm and reassuring. The rescue was a success, and as the woman was airlifted to safety, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Rocky had saved another life, and so had he. That night, back at home, Ethan sat on the porch with Rocky by his side. The stars were bright above them, the air crisp and still. Ethan glanced at the dog, who was gazing out into the darkness, his body relaxed but ready. "You were born for this," Ethan said softly, "and maybe I was too." But this morning felt different, charged with the promise of something new. Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Captain Foster. "We've got something," Foster said, his voice steady. "The arson suspect from the neighborhood fire. He's been spotted near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. But if Rocky's as good as I think he is, we could use another set of eyes, and his nose. The suspect's holed up in there," Foster explained. "We're not sure if he's armed, but he's dangerous, and we think he might have accelerants with him." Ethan followed the beam of his flashlight and froze. A man stood there, partially hidden by the shadows. He was tall and wiry, his clothes smeared with soot. In his hands, he held a canister of gasoline. "Don't move!" Ethan called, his voice firm. He reached for his radio, signaling the police outside. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Ethan and Rocky. "Get that dog away from me!" he shouted, his voice shaking. Ethan stepped closer, keeping his voice calm. "Rocky's here to help. You don't have to make this worse." Seconds later, the police arrived, cuffing the suspect and securing the gasoline canister. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief washing over him. He knelt beside Rocky, ruffling the dog's fur. "Good job, buddy," he said softly. Rocky licked his hand, his eyes bright with satisfaction. Outside the warehouse, Foster approached Ethan, clapping him on the shoulder. "You and Rocky saved lives today," he said. "That guy could have done a lot more damage." "Let me think about it," Ethan said, though he already knew his answer. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch, a beer in hand, and Rocky lying beside him. The stars were bright above, the night peaceful after the day's chaos. The kitten, now a permanent part of their little family, curled up on Rocky's back, purring softly. "You've come a long way," Ethan said, looking at Rocky. "From a rescue dog to a hero." Ethan chuckled, taking a sip of his beer. "You taught me something," he continued, "about moving forward, about finding purpose again." And as the night stretched on, Ethan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Rocky would face them together.